Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural professorial lecture of Professor Mike Wood. I'm Carl Dayson, and I'm Pro Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise here at the University of Salford. It's my honour to invite Professor Wood to deliver his lecture tonight. Mike is no stranger to speaking publicly and about his work, and he's a keen advocate for science communication, so I'm sure we're in for a real treat. He's regularly invited to make keynote speeches and deliver public lectures, including the Royal Institute of Faraday Lecture and the Society for Radiological Protection Dunster Lecture. His work is multi-award winning, with accolades including the Times Higher Education Research Project of the Year and the prestigious SRP Founders Medal. His research on the wildlife of Chernobyl Exclusion Zone is truly groundbreaking. He has pioneered the development of novel technologies to undertake radioecological studies, including camera traps, acoustic recorders and drones. I'm sure Mike will touch on some of that this evening. And his work is informing the International Commission on Radiological Protection Outputs and the work of nuclear regulators and industry. It also underpins radiation protection and capacity building activity that he delivers, including training courses for international bodies, national governments and the UK regulator. Needless to say, we're very proud of Mike here at the University of Salford. Mike is now a chair of applied ecology, but Salford gave him his first permanent role a decade ago as a lecturer in environmental management. So where did his passion and skill for science come from? Mike showed a strong interest in science from an early age. His first lab was his childhood bedroom, so I'm informed, in Warrington, where he put together a chemistry set and electronics, a microscope and a dissection kit, all acquired from various birthdays and Christmases. He apparently had a flair for the experimental and adventurous, and while his parents might have known about his passion for discovery, they didn't quite know about the burn patch on his bedroom table that was left by the thermite reaction that he had set up there. So it's little surprise that Mike pursued a career in science. He studied his undergraduate degree at the University of Liverpool, gaining a BSc Honours in zoology in 1998, just a few years ago, Mike. He knew he wanted to continue his studies and actually worked for a year as a fruit machine and jukebox installation engineer to save up for his master's. So if you've got one of those that need repairing, Mike's your man. In 2000, he went on to graduate with an MSc in pollution and environmental control from the University of Manchester. During his time at Manchester, Mike developed an interest in radiation protection. Immediately after submitting his thesis, he went to work for the Environmental Research and Consultancy, where he began to work on various radioactivity projects, including the development of the environmental radiation protection approach used by the Environment Agency to undertake assessments for protected sites. Mike soon realised he wanted to focus on applied research, and he joined the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Liverpool in 2003, working as an environmental scientist on radioactivity research. The following year, he began a part-time PhD studying the radioecological of temperate coastal sand dune systems. This included field-based research working with a variety of different animals, including Britain's only venomous snake. I assume it was the species, not the only snake. In preparation for this field work, Mike was taught how to handle some of the world's most deadly snakes. There probably aren't many radiation protection professionals who have been formally trained to work with dangerous reptiles. A life in university sector was destiny after that. Mike's research on sand dune and reptile radiology, coupled with his role in developing environmental protection approaches, quickly established Mike's international reputation. After completing his PhD in 2010, Mike took up his first formal academic role, a fixed-term lectureship at Manchester Metropolitan University. 7 months later, I'm pleased to say he was offered a permanent role here at the University of Salford, and he's been here ever since. And here we are today. Ladies and gentlemen, It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Mike Wood's inaugural professorial lecture. Over to you, Mike. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl. And thank you to all of you, both in the auditorium and all those people who are at home watching live. Not all even in this country. I know there are people from all over the world that are connecting in, which is fantastic. Thank you to all of you for taking time out of your evenings, out of your days, to be able to come and listen to this lecture this evening. As you've heard, my lecture is on myth-busting Chernobyl. Really, this is me sharing some of the insights that I've gained over the time I've been working in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, in terms of my first-hand experience of things that I've seen, but also of the things that I've picked up through speaking to those who are from that region of the world. As Carl mentioned, this is actually a special week for me. On Monday, I celebrated 10 years at Salford. So the majestic Peel building has been my home, in inverted commas. Sometimes it really does feel like home, I have to admit. It's been my home for the last 10 years. And as I go into my lecture, I'm going to be maybe mentioning the names of a few people along the way. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of people whose names I would like me to mention. But first of all, I should mention one person in particular without whom none of my Chernobyl work would have happened. And that is my wife, Helen, who's thankfully sitting here. So without Helen's support, without her, even though she's working full time, then also making sure the kids are looked after, I wouldn't be able to go off and do all of the wacky adventurous things that Carl's mentioned that I go off and do. The next people that I want to mention are these two absolutely fantastic scientists. This is Professor David Copplestone and Professor Nick Beresford. These are the two people that initially inspired me to follow a career in radiation protection, environmental radioactivity research. And they've been exceptional friends and collaborators ever since. Much of the Chernobyl research that I do is with Nick, and also with this gentleman here. This is Dr. Sergei Gashak. Nobody knows more about the Chernobyl environment than he does. He has spent decades now working directly within the Chernobyl environment, and he is our local collaborator throughout most of the research that we do. Now, it's probably appropriate for me to start by saying a few words about what happened. Initially, when I started working in Chernobyl, I assumed that everybody would know about Chernobyl, about what had happened, when it happened, where it happened, because I was aware of it. And then I started talking to people, and I realized that people say, hang on, you go and do wildlife in research in Chernobyl, isn't everything dead? How can you do that? So it's worth me just going through some of the basics about Chernobyl and what happened. Well, the first thing is, as you're probably aware, there was a big accident at a nuclear reactor. So that's Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant complex. Somebody at Unit 4 pressed this button up here, AZ5. When they pressed button AZ5, things went very wrong. This is AZ5 on the panel. This is me sitting in the control room. I was not the one that pressed AZ5. Let me just clarify this. And also, I should, for the sake of transparency, also say that that control room is actually the Unit 3 control room. So Unit 4 and Unit 3 are sister reactors. The accident happened, quite serious accident, at Unit 4. The Unit 4 control room is a mess, but Unit 3 control room down the corridor was decontaminated, and you can, with special permissions, go in there. And I'm honoured to have been able to go in on a couple of occasions now and experience what it would have been like to actually sit directly in that control room area. Now, this is an interactive lecture, right? So this is a lecture where I want you guys in the room to respond to questions that I may have of you. I want all of you at home to also participate in this way. This was the best way that we could come up with of making sure that you guys who are listening in via the internet are still able to join in and be part of the lecture. We're going to use slido.com. So if you just, on your mobile devices, and if there's a number of you in the room at home, you know, each of you, be a bit competitive here, use your own devices, go to slido.com and enter in the code. When you go to slido.com, it'll ask you to enter in a code. The code is 536605. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that. When I start to see lots of confident faces in the auditorium here, oh, I'm even seeing thumbs up now. That's very promising. Right, in the interest of keeping the pace going, we're going to go into the first question I'm going to ask you. In what year did the Chernobyl accident happen? So in what year did somebody press AZ5? Please start voting. I can see the numbers going up in the corner, which is great. So 64 people responded, 67. Numbers keeping going up. I'll just wait until the numbers start to slow. Could take a little while before the numbers start to slow, actually, which is good. I think that's starting to slow a little-ish, a little bit now. I think I am just going to have to jump into the answer. So if you've not had a chance to hit it yet, don't worry, you'll have more responses to answer with shortly. Right, the answer is 1986. Well done for all of those that got 1986. But don't worry if you didn't get it right. You know, the purpose of these questions is not to trip anybody up. It's simply so that you can have a bit of a go at joining in with the lecture. 1986, where was I? Well, that's where I was. What cool hair I had. Actually, at least I still had hair at that point, and it wasn't grey as it is now. Yeah, 1986, I was in my second year at junior school. And I remember listening to Newsround. I mean, Newsround was the font of knowledge for every kid, and actually probably still is in terms of what's going on in the world. I remember listening to Newsround and hearing about this accident that had happened in Chernobyl. It was a nuclear accident. Amazing. I'd not got a clue what a nuclear accident was, what the implications were. It just sounded quite impressive. It stuck in my mind. I knew lots of people were talking about it. People seemed to be a bit concerned about it. I didn't really understand why. One thing I also didn't understand is where on earth Chernobyl was. Well, that's my next question for you. In which country is the Chernobyl nuclear power plant located? Again, if you can all start voting, please vote as fast as you can, and we'll try and get those numbers climbing quickly. It's a bit of a fastest finger first thing, so who can do it quickest? Okay, I'm going to do the big reveal. Ukraine. Oh, well done, most of you, for getting that one right. Stormy, I know that there's at least one person that had a bit of a pre-go at this to make sure they got it right on the next run. So, excellent. Ukraine, that's correct. So, Chernobyl, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant complex, sits right at this border between Ukraine and Belarus. So it's up to the north of Kiev. Now, people are aware of Chernobyl. People are aware of perhaps other accidents as well. My question to you is, was Chernobyl the world's first nuclear accident that was serious enough to cause significant radioactive contamination of the environment? Have a go answering. It's a yes, no, so you got a 50-50 chance of getting it right. My daughter's indicating that she doesn't know the answer to this. Never mind. Have a go. All right. No, that's right. Chernobyl was not the world's first serious nuclear accident. Actually, we need to go way back in time to 1957 to find those first serious accidents. And actually 1957 was not a good year if you were in the market for avoiding nuclear accidents, because we had two of them. And we didn't just have two of them, we had two of them within 2 weeks of each other. So the first was at Kishtim. It was the Kishtim accident in Russia, which happened at the end of September 57. Then we get into early October and we have a fire at Windscale pile number 1. Two accidents releasing significant contamination into the environment. Now, nuclear accidents, you may or may not be aware, are actually rated. They're rated on a particular scale, which is the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale. This is a scale that was developed by the International Atomic Energy Agency and the OECD Nuclear Energy Authority. And that pyramid that you see on the screen goes from level 1 through to level 7. Level 1 is, in fact, level 1 to 3 is classed as an incident. Anything above level 3 is classed as an accident, with the accidents becoming more and more serious as you go up to the top of that pyramid. Windscale and Kishtim classified as 5 and 6, respectively, on that pyramid. You may have heard of 3 Mile Island, which happened in 1979. 3 Mile Island classified as level 5. The two recent major accidents, I say recent, you know, Chernobyl 35 years ago now, but the Chernobyl accident in '86 and the Fukushima accident in 2011, they both classified right at the top as major accidents, level 7. But because of the extent of the contamination from the Chernobyl accident and the costs associated with it, actually Chernobyl is classified as the worst of all the nuclear accidents to date. Now, there have been various studies undertaken by international organisations, including the United Nations, on the deaths associated with the Chernobyl accident. And first of all, we're going to look at deaths from radiation within a few months of the Chernobyl accident. And again, it's a question for all of you, so get your phones at the ready. According to the United Nations, how many people died from radiation exposure within a few months of the Chernobyl accident? People are having to think more about this one, so the numbers are climbing more slowly. I'll wait until it reaches 100 and then click on. There we go. Less than 50. This is quite instructive, or quite illustrative, of the view that many people have of the extent of impact on people of the Chernobyl accident. You know, I said at the start about kind of myth-busting Chernobyl. One of the things that people often don't realise is that the number of deaths attributable to radiation exposures in those first months after the accident is surprisingly low. we're talking a total of 30 people dying initially. 2 of them were not even to do with radiation. So there were 28 people died as a result of acute radiation syndrome. And 2 that died as a result of just the explosion taking place and direct impact from that. One of them, this gentleman here, actually ended up entombed in the reactor. His body was not recovered from the reactor. Longer term, beyond those that suffered from acute radiation sickness, there were many who experienced thyroid cancers. Now, the thyroid cancers largely attributed to have arisen as a result of the fact that radioactive iodine was released into the environment. Now, radioactive iodine will accumulate very rapidly into the thyroid. When it's released into the environment, goes onto the grass, cows eat the grass, cows produce the milk, lots of kids come along and drink lots of milk. Those who were less than 18 at the time of the Chernobyl accident have actually been found to have many thyroid cancers within that grouping. Now, part of that will undoubtedly be as a result of the radioiodine exposure. Part of it is because they're comparing to a baseline where there was actually much less screening than there then was subsequently. And if you think back, for example, in the early stages of the COVID pandemic, if you remember, we were starting to see the numbers of positive tests each day. And then it looked like things were going absolutely bonkers as we started doing more tests. Not surprisingly, if you test more and you screen more people, you're going to find more. So part of the increase is undoubtedly down to that as well. Again, work from the United Nations has looked at the proportion of the thyroid cancers identified within this region, which are likely to be attributable to the radioiodine exposure and radiation from Chernobyl. And they reckon that there's probably about 5,000 people that have ended up with cancers, thyroid cancers, as a result of this exposure. But because thyroid cancer is so treatable if diagnosed earlier, because the screening's happening so much to actually identify and diagnose it early, actually, if you look at that report, it suggests that probably only 15 people have died as a result of the thyroid cancer. So if you take what you might have as an initial mindset in terms of the extent of human health impact of the Chernobyl accident, and then compare that with the information that comes out of the United Nations, for example, you'll see there's perhaps quite a difference between the perspective and what the United Nations may say is the reality. Now, I have to admit, many people around the world also do challenge the findings of the United Nations and do question some of the methods that they've used. But currently, if I was asked to give you a number associated with Chernobyl accident in terms of number of deaths, that's the official international line. Overall, they concluded that the great majority of the population is not likely to experience serious health consequences as a result of radiation from the Chernobyl accident. And something that has been raised by a number of people, and particularly here, Robert Gale, who's a medic from the US, in a publication called The Cancer Letter. He and others have raised the point that actually the radiophobia aspect and the misunderstanding of radiation has resulted in far greater impacts than the radiation itself. So, for example, here, he's quoting an estimate of more than 1 million unnecessary abortions as a result of a misunderstanding of the radiation risk. Now, even if that is a dramatically over-the-top estimate, you can still see that there is something of an imbalance between what actually happened by way of radiation exposure and radiation impact versus what perhaps has happened as a result of the the misunderstandings that people have had about radiation. The other thing that you need to bear in mind is that at the time of the accident and shortly after the accident, there was a mass evacuation of people from the area around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant complex. Now, that evacuation from that area saw people leaving Pripyat, which was the model city, the amazing place that everyone wanted to live at, built specifically to house workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant complex. Pripyat opened its doors in 1970. The accident happened in 1986, so it was a maximum of 16 years that people had lived in Pripyat. 90-odd villages scattered around the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone as it is now were abandoned. People had to leave their homes, never to return. These were places where they'd lived for generations and generations. You know, their parents, their grandparents buried in the cemeteries in these villages. Not surprisingly, Chernobyl had a huge psychological toll. The reason that you see this picture here of these two ugly mugs and this lovely smiley lady here, this is Irina. She runs the hotel, I'll call it in inverted commas. Let's maybe view it as a particular type of accommodation that will allow you to get through to the following morning. It's not exactly the Ritz, but it's somewhere where we can stay while we're working in Chernobyl. Now, Irina is normally extremely smiley until she starts talking about the accident, at which point her expression changes and the tears start rolling down her cheeks. Because Irina was a kid living in Pripyat at the time of the accident. She remembers being told to get on one of the cattle buses that was taking some of the 60,000 cattle out so that they could get her out faster rather than having to wait for a seat on one of the coaches that was going out. She remembers a life in Pripyat before the accident and then everything having to be left behind. She's taken the decision to actually go back and work in Chernobyl town within the exclusion zone, helping to manage and run this accommodation. But it just goes to illustrate, just through that one story, the psychological impact, the immense psychological impact that occurred as a result of the accident. And not surprisingly, Ukraine has seen issues with alcoholism and other mental health issues associated with this. Now, I want to say a few words about the spread of contamination. When you look at the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, you've obviously got a spread of contamination that occurred across the zone. You can see different colours on that map indicating different levels of contamination. Many of you will be aware that that plume of contamination also went much further afield, went right over Europe. And indeed, in the UK uplands, we had substantial deposition of radioactivity. I mentioned my friend Nick Beresford earlier on. Nick, in his younger years here, was actually involved with monitoring radioactivity in sheep at the time of the accident, in the short term after it. When the accident occurred, obviously, I've said it spread contamination far and wide. In the near field environment, we have this area which is known as the Red Forest. It wasn't always called the Red Forest. Actually, before the accident, it was probably just called Forest. At the time of the accident, we had a spike of contamination, a contamination plume that was blown out to the west. It's formed what's now known as the Western Trace. As that contamination plume touched down, the first area that it really hit was this forest area. And the radiation levels were so high that the trees died. They gradually turned that reddy brown colour that you're so used to seeing when you stick your Christmas tree outside and then leave it for a while. They gradually turned that reddy brown colour, hence where the name Red Forest came from. And you can see with this helicopter flying over the top of the red forest, how distinct the colour change is. You can see the edge of that plume as it's gone through. Now, the red forest actually regenerated then as a deciduous forest. And if you look at this top right image, you can actually see one of the old trees, one of the original pine trees that was killed, lying there on the floor. Now, I'm not going to do this as a slider. I'm actually just going to get a quick show of hands. Do you think that people live in the zone? Yes or no? Hands up for yes. Yeah, most people reckon people live in the zone. Most people have probably heard reports of people living in the zone. I mean, Sergei pretty much lives there. At least I think his wife probably feels like he pretty much lives there. Then again, I think my wife probably feels like I do as well. So Sergei has got this house in Chernobyl town. This house we use as a field station where we have got labs set up. This house is also used by Sergei as his accommodation. So we sometimes get breakfast in there in the morning. Sergei's very artistic with his production of breakfast, which is always very nice. And we use it for all sorts of lab-based research activity. I mean, this is proper field lab stuff. Here's another person that lives in the zone. I don't mean Vic Gill here from the BBC or indeed the camera crew. I mean this lady. She invited us to go and spend an hour or two with her on the morning of her birthday and treated us to a variety of extremely unhealthy Ukrainian dietary items, some of which I really couldn't stomach, and actually I regretted not drinking when I was watching people trying to wash down what they'd just taken with the vodka that she was passing around at about 10 o'clock in the morning. What was particularly entertaining though is that this lovely lady, very traditional in much of her approach, then took a phone call on a mobile phone. So we were greeted with this lady who looked like she was living the true rural lifestyle straight out with a mobile phone, and off she went to have a chat. Next question for you to all respond to. Maybe a statement, should I say. So the statement is, I'd be worried about visiting Chernobyl because of the level of radiation in the environment. So if you can answer yes or no to that, please. Again, we'll be looking at the numbers going up. Okay, I'll click over there. No, so lots of people would not be concerned about visiting Chernobyl, which is, nice to hear. It's good to hear. Even when we've spoken to communities that live just on the outside of the exclusion zone, they've shown a real reticence to the idea of going into the zone because of concerns about radiation levels. And actually, across the general public as a whole, lots of people do voice concerns about the radiation level. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to share with you a picture collage that one of my former PhD students, Moo, here from Thailand, put together. And he was a very brave Thai PhD student, really. He came over to Manchester. He said Manchester was really cold and he couldn't quite cope with how cold it was. And then he decided that he was going to do his PhD studying reindeer in an area of Norway that hits minus 27 degrees C in the winter. And, he was brave, but he also came out to Chernobyl with us. And what he did was Nick lent him his radiation. I'll read out the numbers just in case you can't see them clearly. So this is on the aeroplane, 3.7. This is in an abandoned building in one of the villages in Chernobyl, 1.2. This is in one of the forest areas where we undertake research, not the red forest, but one of the other forest areas, 2.3. And this is right next to the reactor building itself, 6.5. So less than 2 times higher than the plane when you're standing next to the reactor building. Now that's something that often surprises many people. Actually, what's happening is something that's been well documented for well over a century. And that is that as you increase in altitude, like when you're going up in a plane, you increase your exposure to cosmic radiation. This is radiation that's coming from the sun, from outside of the solar system. Theodore Wolff demonstrated this by going up the Eiffel Tower, measuring radiation at the bottom, measuring radiation at the top, higher measurements at the top. Hess, Kulhurster then sent balloons up. Those balloons went to heights of about 5.3 kilometers and then up to about 9 kilometers. And each time they found that the radiation increased substantially, the radiation measurements increased substantially as you fly. So it's not that I'm saying, don't fly, it's really dangerous for your health or anything like that. I'm simply saying, let's put this in perspective. If you're going to take a long haul flight where you go even higher altitude over to Chernobyl, the chances are during the time that you're in the cruising altitude position, your radiation exposure is going to be higher than when you're on the ground wandering around in Chernobyl. Again, perhaps not an awful lot of people know that. Out of interest, how many of you have visited Cornwall? So this is another Slido one. You don't have to put your hands up. You can actually, so I know that you guys at home aren't putting your hands up, but all of the people in here, oh yeah, I did. So please use Slido, vote away. Yes, lots of people have visited Cornwall. Did you feel scared visiting Cornwall because of radiation exposure? I'm guessing probably not. But the reality is that radiation levels on a beach in Cornwall are not dissimilar from radiation levels in some of these lower contamination areas of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. And actually, this is why the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone is such a good natural laboratory for us, because it allows us to study animals, plants within an abandoned area which has a gradient of different contamination levels. We suddenly have something which is, okay, not true control sites, but something akin to control areas versus test areas. So given that the accident happened 35 years ago, given that certainly Nick and Sergey have been working there since the early 90s, studying radiation and its impacts, you'd think that we probably know an awful lot about how radiation impacts on the environment, and we've probably got this pretty much tied up now. No. This is still a world of controversy. There are still studies that are coming up with very different findings about the impacts of radiation on wildlife. You can see 2 headlines from the BBC here. One, Chernobyl species decline linked to DNA. The other, wildlife defies Chernobyl radiation. So 2 headlines, BBC, obviously different reports that they're latching into. We also see here that we have forests around Chernobyl aren't decaying properly, one headline. And then we have a paper, and note that it's only a paper, it's not actually a media headline, saying that effectively leaf litter decomposition is not being impacted by radiation. So we've got one saying decaying is happening at a reduced rate as a result of radiation, the other one saying it isn't. Now, the fact that I couldn't find a headline for this does illustrate one of the issues that we often face in science, which is often the media don't like negative results. They want the big headlines. They want the, wow, isn't this terrible? Isn't something really significant happening here? And that further fuels the kind of controversy that we see and potentially introduces that danger of academics almost being pushed to chase the headlines because of the importance of getting their work known. There are all sorts of different pitfalls that we may face when we're looking at doing research in a natural laboratory. And there's a couple of people I'm going to introduce you to very quickly. There's Ben Goldacre and there's John Ioannidis. Both of them have published really interesting documents, be it book or papers, which highlight some of the issues with many scientific studies that are undertaken, and certainly highlight the importance of controlling for bias within the study. That's something that we've really tried hard to do within our work. We recognise the fact that if we are outside in the field making observations, we have a particular preconception about whether radiation is good or bad. It's really hard to ignore the beep, beep, beep from our radiation dose meter as we're wandering around in the exclusion zone and not be aware of whether or not we're standing in a high contamination area or a low contamination area. So we've used things like cameras, acoustic recorders. You may have seen the display that Helen's had upstairs showing about some of the work that she's been doing with bird acoustics. These allow us to capture data from the zone, bring it back, blind analyse it, and then formulate conclusions which minimise the influence of bias. Our cameras have captured all sorts of interesting wildlife, so I'm just going to flick through these quickly. Just shout out what the animals are. What is it? Boar. Raccoon dog. Excellent. Well done. Wolf. Yes. See, yeah. Yeah. Przewalski's horse. Excellent. Yeah. It's a bear. It's probably the one and only bear selfie that you're ever going to see. That's the beast. So yeah, that's one of the bears of the exclusion zone as well. So if you see a headline like that, it's, you know, Chernobyl zone shows decline in biodiversity, and then you see some of the diversity of wildlife that's there, it's not an immediate thing that you can easily marry up. Now, it's important that we get some sort of consensus, some sort of common understanding about the extent to which radiation really is impacting the environment, because let's face it, our science feeds into policy, it feeds into regulation. And also, we find ourselves quite often having to sit in front of camera crews and answer questions like, how much radiation does it take to harm wildlife? Now, I was getting it easy there. Poor Sergey, on the other hand, why? He was swamped. Other things that have raised concern about Chernobyl are things like the fires. So 2015, there were lots of media reports about fire in the exclusion zone. Russia Today contacted me and said, will you come on and actually tell everybody about how terrible this is and the fact that this is really going to have serious health implications for the people of Russia. Not surprisingly, I declined that interview. But fires do occur commonly in the zone. You know, the 2015 fires, well away from the reactor. 2016, the Red Forest burned. The world's most radioactively contaminated terrestrial ecosystem up in flames. Serious, serious burn. Was there much media coverage of this in the UK? No, actually, not a jot. Why? Well, it seems like something else was preoccupying everybody's minds at the time. We did see peaks in radiation levels being detected around the time of the fire. But actually, when we've done the maths, as it were, and in this paper we do analyse the data, it shows that the radiation exposure that resulted from this, both to the firefighters and the wider public, is likely to be extremely low. Have you heard reports about mutant animals in Chernobyl? Again, if you do a quick Slido blast for me, please. Yes, lots of people have heard reports of the mutant animals in Chernobyl. It doesn't surprise me. It's one of those things that permeates through popular culture. If you believe some of the things, then actually this is who I meet when I go and work in the exclusion zone. Now, I admit some of the workers in the zone, after a night on the vodka, look a bit rough, but they certainly ain't like that. People see things like, you know, Blinky and The Simpsons and get that kind of jokey view of mutants as a result of radiation. But actually, there are other people who genuinely do believe this. I remember in about 2015 going to deliver a presentation at a conference in Georgia, in the US. And as I was going into the US, as you're probably all very familiar with, you go in and a customs official gets all big and in your face and looks sternly at you and says, right, what are you doing here? And I started to explain that I was here to present at a conference. Okay, what are you presenting on? This was somebody that was suddenly quite interested. I'm presenting on Chernobyl. This is then somebody who became really interested. There was a queue building behind me of really angry people after a long haul flight. As he starts to ask me about the earthworms the size of snakes that he's been told about that live in Chernobyl. So yeah, this idea of mutants in the exclusion zone is something that carries through many places. Can you go on holiday to Chernobyl? Yes, you can. You certainly can go on holiday to Chernobyl. Actually, over the time that I've been going to Chernobyl, I've gone from turning up at the checkpoint, being the only person there with my scientific collaborators, guys with guns looking really seriously at me, to turning up at the checkpoint, being able to go to the kiosk, buy a few souvenirs, have a little drink, look at the information boards, selfie there, you know, and on you go. It's changed so much. Now, admittedly, if you do go on holiday to Chernobyl, be aware that the breakfast cuisine isn't always the greatest. If you don't like eggs, don't go. And also, if you end up in the hotel that I sometimes end up in, make sure that you're ready to use whatever means necessary to do things like flush the toilets. The only way to get that one to work was you just pull the siphon out and hope for the best. Obviously, if you go, you'll get to see places like Pripyat. Many of you are familiar with the images of Pripyat, particularly the Ferris wheel. And you may have seen through things like Virtual Chernobyl, the images of things like this waterfront cafe. You'll also undoubtedly get to see some of the abandoned villages, but also some of the beautiful natural environments there, the aquatic systems, forest systems, even some weirdo in a hat. You never know what you're going to encounter. Now, I mentioned Virtual Chernobyl. People that are here this evening in person have been able to have a go with Virtual Chernobyl. You at home should be able to download a brief video of it via that link. It's something that I've used to communicate with audiences all around the world. I've used it with engaging with Ukrainian school kids, with people in communities living bordering the exclusion zone. Even the head of the state agency of Ukraine for exclusion zone management loved experiencing Virtual Chernobyl. I've taken it over to Japan and helped to teach people about science communication, talking to the public over there associated with Fukushima. It's also been out to Thailand as well. Virtual Chernobyl has also helped me to run virtual field trips at the university. During the period of pandemic, we've been able to have mini socially distanced virtual field trips in a projection chamber that the university's got called the Octave. Now, I've been extremely privileged to be able to work out in the exclusion zone and to work with a huge variety of exceptional collaborators, and just some of them are pictured here. I've tried to share my learning, the science that I do, and I've tried to inspire the next generation, inspiring them through things like developing a stage show, a bit like the Christmas lectures kind of thing, with interactive experiments that school kids can come up onto the stage to do. I've hopefully also inspired my own kids. You know, this is slightly old photos now, but here's Abigail actually helping me out at a science festival, greeting people and showing them some of the wildlife of the zone. And this is Eleanor actually getting into the idea of getting into scientific experimentation and looking extremely embarrassed now that there's a picture of her up on the screen. I've worked, as I say, with local communities out in Chernobyl, played musical chairs with kids from the kindergarten at Narodicci to the west of the exclusion zone, sharing the science that we do there, but then also contrast that with things like going to the Houses of Parliament and presenting to MPs and members of the House of Lords. That's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of Chernobyl, highlighting some of the myths, perhaps busting a few of those, maybe just giving you some new things to think about. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd now welcome any questions that you've got from the audience and also anything that's coming online. So thank you. Right, question from the audience first of all. Yeah.
Radiation exposure is monitored over your working life if you're exposed to it regularly. So how far are you?
Well, one of the things I did consider doing was dropping all of the lights in here to prove that I don't glow in the dark, which is one of those questions that people often ask me. In reality, my radiation exposure is very low in comparison with somebody that works in a nuclear regulated facility. Yes, I go out and work in the zone. Most of the time, I'm not working in the Red Forest, right? So my annual exposure is still well below anything of concern. And when I'm there, as I say, if I monitor my dose rate over the time, which I do, I've got that PED blue that you saw that's monitoring the radiation. I find that it really isn't going very high throughout most of the time. When I go into the Red Forest, yes, the dose rate is high. I don't spend long there before I'm out again. So in terms of radiation, that's not an issue. Much more significant in terms of health risks from Chernobyl are things like the fact that there's huge open pits that you can easily fall into. You've got grass this high that you're walking along through. Suddenly there's a manhole without the cover on because somebody's looted the metal at some point in the past. And actually, one of my colleagues, who I think is watching, she was involved with some of our Ukrainian collaborators in a rescue mission because they got to one of these manholes and they found that there was a young Chevalsky's horse that had fallen down the hole. Panic on. Thankfully, they did a sterling job, managed to rescue the horse, and the horse just went away happily afterwards. So, yeah, there are some significant risks there, but actually the radiation hazard, relatively speaking, is much less of a concern than some of the other physical hazards. I'll ask or go to a question here. So I've got a question, which is, why is the exclusion zone such an irregular shape? If you look at the mapping, part of that boundary movement was really defined on areas of contamination. So people think of it as a 30-kilometre zone. It's not just a case of getting a piece of string on a map and going and drawing around a 30-kilometre radius of the zone. This is actually something which is broadly a 30-kilometre zone, but it's mapped around key areas of contamination. Any other questions for the room? Neil?
The most popular one on the slide is, in your opinion, how accurate was the drama Chernobyl to reality?
Right. I'm sort of glad that I've been asked this, because up until relatively recently, I had not watched the HBO miniseries. And I kept on getting asked questions by journalists and people when I was doing presentations, and I was sort of thinking, I don't really know because I've not seen it. But then, thankfully, Helen bought me the DVD for Christmas, and I sat and I binge watched the series. I thought the series was great from the perspective of giving you more of an insight into the accident, what happened, and gave you that sense of some of the sort of personal stories associated with the accident. There was obviously some artistic license taken in terms of Hollywooding up some of the things about radiation and how much radiation risk patients that have been exposed to external radiation really then pose to others when they were moved into a hospital setting. And there was some blending of historical figures into individual characters where you got multiple people merged into one. But overall, it was great. It was a great way of raising people's awareness of Chernobyl. What it did do, though, as well, is it perhaps reinforced that view that many people had of the kind of grey, crumbling, derelict wasteland of Chernobyl, rather than the biodiverse ecosystems that we see today. So it's a good mini-series, but also make sure you do recognise the reality associated with Chernobyl as well. Any other questions from the room? Yeah.
So like what you see is the future of the area, so you see a sort of like what is it? You see more of a scientific place, like what's your sort of round of the future of the area?
So my views on the future of the zone. First of all, it's worth saying that the majority of the area is now designated as a biosphere reserve. So this diversity of wildlife that we're seeing returning into this area has been recognised internationally. It's been recognised by the Ukrainian government, and the area is now designated specifically as a biosphere reserve. And we collaborate with those that manage the biosphere reserve. There is then that technical area, if you like, in the centre, where there's obviously ongoing management of the radioactive wastes left as a result of the reactor accident. That arch that you've seen built over the reactor has all sorts of robots that can operate inside it to be able to help with that decommissioning process. Tourism has been increasing in Chernobyl over time, that kind of disaster tourism aspect. After the HBO miniseries, tourism went through the roof. I mean, it was terrible. Sometimes you'd turn up at the checkpoint, you'd have to wait for ages because of the number of coaches that were in front of you waiting to get through. What is also starting to happen now, though, is this interest in ecotourism. So, you know, there's this great diversity of wildlife that we're starting to see. People want to go and see the wildlife. Now, I have a concern here. My concern is that if we have people going into the areas that the wildlife are using to such a great extent that they're creating a major disturbance factor, actually it's no longer going to be such a biodiversity hotspot as a result of that. So I think there's different aspects to this future of Chernobyl. The other thing that's interesting, though, is they've got a massive solar farm there now as well. So you've gone from nuclear power generation, the impacts of that, to an area that's now abandoned and gives you an area for a huge solar farm. So it's a really interesting place. Any other questions from the room?
There's a good book by a physicist called David McKay. It was kind of back at the fact packet calculations about how we solve the energy crisis.
Yeah.
Climate crisis. He thought that going forward, it's a few years out of date now, but the nuclear power had to be in the mix. What are the lessons we learned about science communication? Because obviously, the way your talk has illustrated some of the myths that grew up and perhaps influenced policymakers.
Yeah.
Over the relative risk of burning tons and tons of coal versus having a nuclear power station there.
Yeah, I mean, so that question about the sort of the role of nuclear moving forward is something that comes up again and again. And actually, if you look at lots of countries, nuclear is forming a key part of their energy strategy for the coming years as they're trying to reduce carbon emissions. Obviously, it would be lovely if we could all just jump straight to renewables. That'd be great, but it's just not practical at this stage. They're not at a level that supplies the energy needs that we require. So nuclear is almost like a stepping stone that we can use towards that. I think because you're seeing this within energy policies now, it's not so much the the government officials that you need to convince about the appropriateness of that. It's the population as a whole, and that's why these kind of talks to the general public that allow people to understand more about the reality versus perhaps the kind of perceptions they're gaining from popularized media are so important. And certainly when you look at the health risks associated with living next to a nuclear power station versus the health risks of living close to a coal-fired power station, there is a huge difference, and I certainly know where I prefer to live. Time for one more question. I'm just going to pick a question from here, if I may, just to make sure that we're doing questions from those at home as well. I'll answer any of your questions afterwards, Stephen. All right. Where do people who live in the zone go grocery shopping? Are there shops there? In Chernobyl town, there are actually 3, 4 shops that we can go to buy certain things. Now, we're not talking department stores here. Yeah, we're talking fairly simple places. But you can get certain key things. You can get your vodka, you can get your beer, and you can get bread. And you can get a few other items as well. You know, it's not as bad as all that. Those that are living in the more remote village areas, there is actually some degree of van going round selling groceries as well. So, you know, the lady that I showed you who had the mobile phone, but was living a generally rural lifestyle, she still has access to some supply. So there is something that's there. It's not that people are encouraged to live in the zone, but likewise, the Ukrainian government doesn't want to just leave them destitute if they have returned to areas within the zone. I'm going to have to close it there. Thank you so much once again to all of you. I hope that you've enjoyed this evening. I hope that you found it interesting. And I'm now going to hand back over to Carl for a couple of closing remarks. Thank you.
I think we'll all agree that was a wonderful talk, Mike, and really inspiring. I think the science communication was as strong as the story about Chernobyl as well. I think some of the questions drew that out. As a token of appreciation and a memorial for the work you've done for this particular lecture, the university has put together this small gift for you, which I hope you'll find suitably
That is fantastic.
I
can already see what this is. So for those of you that maybe can't see very easily at home, this is a gorgeous plaque showing the Pripyat sign, which will definitely have to find pride of place at home.
Ladies and gentlemen, here and at home, will you join me in once again thanking Mike Wood for his wonderful inaugural.
Thank you. Thanks, Carl. Thank you very much.
And I think we'll say goodbye to those on the internet, but those that are in the room will now retire for drinks and join Mike, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you all. Thank you. Appreciate it.